Sorry about that. I'm allergic to nerds LARPing in their basement. What's up, everybody? I'm Finn McKenty. This is the Punk Rock MBA, and today I'm here with a video that I never thought I would make, a video about black metal. Now, a lot of people have asked me to do a video about black metal, and I always kind of said no because I wasn't really sure what I could possibly add, because this has been documented so many times, right? And also, to be honest, I don't like it. But then I said, you know what? That's a cop-out. I don't just make videos about stuff I like. I make videos about things that are important to the heavy music scene, and whether I like it or not, black metal is definitely an important part of the heavy music scene. So I'm gonna try to explain to myself and anybody else that's not into black metal, like, what's the deal? Why do people like this stuff so much? But first, I'd like to thank BAM for sponsoring this video. Have you ever thought to yourself, man, I wish the internet had a just metal button, like, boop, give me metal? Well, if you have, then check this out. BAM for Metal brings you everything new in metal as it's happening on the web. You personalize the content you see by choosing from over 1,100 artists. Here's the latest from each artist on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. You can see all the metal bands with upcoming live show dates near you and how to get tickets. You can explore over 20,000 metal albums with over 100 new releases every week, play 30-second previews or stream it in Apple Music, and best of all, it's unfiltered, unblocked, no ads, just metal. So if that sounds cool to you and you're ready to smash that metal button, check out the link in the description and you will get the first month for free. And with that out of the way, let's get into it. So part one, the history of black metal in, I don't know, 3 or 4 minutes, focusing specifically on a few key things that are important to what I'm going to talk about later in the video. Black metal started back in the early 80s with bands like Venom and Bathory and a couple others. Venom actually had a song called Black Metal back in 1983, so I guess technically maybe they invented black metal, but they didn't sound like black metal the way we think of it now. Like, they kind of sound like Motorhead, actually. Black metal. Black metal. By the way, if you've never paid attention to the lyrics to this song, they're amazing, like hilariously awful. But black metal as we know it started in like the late 80s, early 90s with all those Norwegian bands that you're probably familiar with. Mayhem, Darkthrone, Immortal, Satyricon, Emperor, all the bands that sound like this. Or this. Now, as far as what happened after that, I'm going to skip over a whole lot of details here because, like I said, it's been told so many times before. You can go read Lords of Chaos or whatever if you want to know all the details. There's really like 2 things that I want to focus on that, to me, are the most interesting part of black metal. The first thing is what you would call, I guess, the creative directions, the music, the artwork, the imagery, all that stuff. And to me, the kind of key thing to understand about that is that this was a reactionary movement. It was a reaction to what was happening in death metal, which at the time was kind of the most popular, trendy thing going on in metal. They felt like death metal had gotten like stale and boring because it was too clean and precise and technical. And it's kind of funny that they would say that because the stuff that they were talking about by today's standards actually sounds pretty rough. Stuff like this. But I get it. In hindsight, they weren't wrong. Like, death metal had become a little bit stale and boring, and it had become a contest of like who could play the most clean, precise, technical shit with the best production. And a lot of it did sound samey and boring. There was like hundreds of bands, dozens of records coming out every week that sounded like this. And it's not that that stuff's bad, it's just like, enough already. Do we need a dozen albums like this every week? And so they said, fuck that. Like, we're gonna deliberately sound like shit as a way to like give the middle finger to all these death metal nerds that wanna be super clean and precise. We're gonna make records that sound like this. And the same was true of the artwork and imagery too. At the time, death metal imagery was kind of defined by the work of a guy named Dan Seagrave and a lot of other people that ripped him off. All these like super elaborate, colorful, like intricately detailed paintings. And for the record, I love Dan Seagrave's artwork, but again, there's such a thing as too much of a good thing. And just like they did all these like deliberately raw, nasty, lo-fi recordings, they did the same thing with their artwork. And by now, that whole like black and white photocopied image kind of thing with old English letters, by now that's super familiar. You've seen it a billion times. But back then, it was really new and shocking and different because it was like the exact opposite of what all the death metal bands are doing with their like elaborate, detailed, colorful Dan Seagrave type paintings. And it was the same story with the way they dressed, where the death metal bands were super down to earth and basically just looked like dudes off the street in like shorts and t-shirts. The black metal guys again did the exact opposite of whatever the death metal guys were doing. Instead of being like normal dudes off the street, they did the whole like corpse paint and spikes and homemade armor and medieval weapons and taking pictures in the basement thing. You've seen all these famous photos like this one or this one. And in case you think I'm exaggerating or making this up about like how much of this was just a deliberate opposite reaction to death metal, check out this quote. "It means black clothes, spikes, crosses, and so on. But today there are only children in jogging suits and skateboards and hardcore moral ideas. They try to look as normal as possible. These stupid people must fear black metal, but instead they love shitty bands like Deicide, Benediction, Napalm Death, Sepultura, and all that shit. We must take this scene to what it was in the past. Dead died for this cause, and now I have declared war. Death to false black metal or death metal." I just love the idea of this nerd from some like small city in Norway getting so angry about the fact that some American death metal band is wearing shorts. It was like the 90s equivalent of the guys that make videos like this.
I can say with confidence that the style known as brutal death, grindcore, whatever the fuck, is not music by definition, but a vociferous, ostentatious, overglorified noisemaker by demonstrable fact.
So that was like the creative direction, which I think was the first component of what made black metal blow up. But the second thing was basically the drama. Again, I'm not going to go into the details because this has been told a million times, but to make a long story short, like these were actually unhinged, crazy people that did like legitimately fucked up shit, like burn churches and stab people and kill each other and commit suicide and bring dead animals on stage and throw blood on people. Like it was fucked up. It made like actual mainstream newspaper headlines, and everybody is fascinated by it because like how could you not be, right? It was crazy. It was like some comic book or movie like come to life. How could you not pay attention?
The band's former vocalist blew his own brains out with a shotgun, and then his bandmates made necklaces from pieces of his skull.
So on that note, before I talk about why I don't like black metal, let me first just say some nice things about it. First of all, it really was like shockingly new and fresh and different. If you've watched my other videos, you know that I love people who just like come out of nowhere, do something shockingly new and different that breaks all the rules and pisses off the gatekeepers, and black metal definitely did that. Second, I actually really respect their creative vision. I think they were right that death metal had gotten a little bit stale and boring and bloated, and that like nasty, fucked up, raw, lo-fi vibe is something that, you know, as somebody who grew up listening to a lot of like hardcore and punk and grind and stuff like that, I can appreciate that. It was a giant middle finger to like the metal establishment at the time, and I can respect that in the same way as that I love what the Dadaists were doing like 100 years ago as like a fuck you to the uptight, stale art world of the time. But with that said, that's pretty much where my appreciation for black metal stops. And that brings us to part two. What's my problem with black metal? You might think it's because of the shitty recordings, right? The ones that sound like they were made on a Fisher-Price cassette recorder in the back of a cave somewhere. But like I talked about earlier, I actually don't mind that at all. In fact, I kind of like it. And it's actually not the politics either, although that is definitely a turnoff. Like the fact that there is an entire subgenre of Nazi black metal is definitely troubling. No, my problem with black metal is actually much more simple than that. I think it's boring. Boring music, boring forced edginess, boring recycled imagery, stale. It's just not interesting to me. If there ever was something interesting and fresh about black metal, well, that was like driven on the ground decades ago. Sure, it was interesting when Mayhem and Darkthrone did the like lo-fi recordings and spikes and corpse paint thing 25, 30 years ago, but it was a lot less interesting when 9,000 bands came out that were like exact carbon copies of every single thing that those bands ever did. Like, it's not rebellious to sound like shit when everybody sounds like shit, right? And yes, I'm aware that there were other developments in black metal after that early 90s era that I'm talking about, but to be honest, I would say the same thing about all those. There's the symphonic bands that copy Dimmu Borgir, there's the hipster black metal bands that copy Deafheaven, there's the like melodic blackened death metal bands or whatever you want to call them that copy Dissection. You know, I could go on, but to me, it's just a very derivative genre.
I've seen a lot of bands, you know, copy my makeup, and I don't care, because there's only one Abbath.
Now, you might be saying, isn't that true of every subgenre? Isn't every subgenre defined by a handful of pioneers and then a whole bunch of shitty bands that knock them off? Yes, if you said that, you would be right. That is true of pretty much every subgenre. But the reason why it's a lot harder for me to look past that in the case of black metal is because of the disparity between how black metal presents itself and the reality of what it actually is. Black metal seems to think of itself as this group of like intellectually and creatively and morally superior, rugged individualists who don't give a fuck what anybody thinks of them. But in reality, it's a bunch of mostly really derivative bands that are copying stuff that other people did 20 or 30 years ago, wearing goofy costumes, taking themselves seriously, and acting like giant fucking assholes to everybody else.
Who are they? It's Roots. Which one? Who the fuck are you talking to? Fuck them.
And before anybody mentions it, yes, you could absolutely say the same thing about like real punk, which is why I'm very critical of that genre for all the same reasons. I guess if I was to sum it up, I feel about black metal the way that a lot of people probably feel about metalcore. It's a bunch of like generic, trendy bands that kind of all sound the same to me, and they seem a lot more interested in their image than they do in making interesting music. But you know what? All that might not even bother me if the black metal fan base wasn't so notoriously shitty. And I think that even most black metal fans would agree with me on that one. It's a genre that's pretty much defined by gatekeeping and conformity, right? Like if you listen to that quote I read from Euronymous a minute ago, it's basically him like laying out the dress code and enforcing it and saying, if you don't listen to the right bands and wear the right clothes, you can't sit at our table. It's rigid conformity packaged as rebellion. And I don't know about you, but when I read that quote, I'm just like, dude, you can take that dress code and list of approved bands and shove it up your ass. That sounds like the exact opposite of all the reasons that I got involved with punk and hardcore and metal in the first place, and it's especially hard to take seriously coming from a guy who put on homemade armor and posed for pictures in the basement of their house because it kind of looks like a castle dungeon if you turn the lights down a little bit. Oh yeah, and there is the Nazi thing. Kind of hard to look past that. With all that being said, like I mentioned earlier, there are actually some little pockets of black metal that I really, really love. Some people doing some very interesting, like very challenging, creative, avant-garde kind of stuff, I guess you would say. And I don't hear people talk about them that often, so I just wanted to mention those quickly before we move on. The first one is Havohej. As you can tell, this is pretty weird shit, but this is by far my favorite black metal band. Dethrone the Son of God is the album that most people seem to like, and I do like that one. But what I like even more is all the later stuff, which is really more of what you would call like ambient dark noise than anything you would call metal, I guess. Second is Torture. Along the same lines is really more like weird atmospheric dark ambient noise than like metal. I don't really know much about this band other than I love them. If you know anything about it, let me know in the comments. I would love to hear more stuff from them if it exists. And Abruptum. More like noisy ambient kind of stuff, but much more polished than Torture or Havohej. Like there's actual riffs that you can hear. And the last one, I'm actually not going to try to pronounce the name of this band. So obviously some pretty inaccessible, difficult stuff. I don't know if I would necessarily choose to sit down and listen to this very often, but I really respect how just like weird and challenging it is. So this stuff is interesting to me because it really like fulfills the promise of everything that black metal said it was in the beginning. It's actually challenging and even like challenges the creative boundaries of black metal itself. Like as far as I know, even black metal fans don't like this stuff very much. And I will always back people who push the creative boundaries. So as always, I like to try to keep things constructive and positive, even if I am being a little bit critical. So let me wrap this up with a few takeaways that I think are going to be helpful for anybody out there that's got a band or a podcast or YouTube channel or artwork, like any kind of creative project where you're struggling with marketing, which I think is a place where most creatives struggle. Because whether I like it or not, I do have to admit that black metal bands were really fucking good at marketing, and there's a lot that we can learn from them.
Oh man, that is hot.
Thing number one is the power of tribalism as a marketing tactic. I've talked about this a bunch in the context of bands like Five Finger Death Punch and My Chemical Romance and Insane Clown Posse, and it's super relevant here as well. Black metal is all about harnessing the power of that us versus them dynamic, because humans are hardwired to this. We're tribal creatures. We're programmed to come together in bands and be distrustful and suspicious of anybody that's not in our tribe, right? It's just evolutionary biology.
One of us, we accept that one of us, Google Gobble, one of us.
But the black metal bands intuitively took advantage of that part of human psychology, where they were the ones fighting for real metal, fighting against the posers who wanted to like commercialize metal by wearing shorts and playing technical death metal. It sounds kind of ridiculous, right? But obviously there's people who believed in it. People literally killed for that. Tribalism is powerful shit. So the takeaway is, if you can position yourself as the champion for this group of misunderstood, oppressed people, that is powerful marketing. And second, the power of storytelling and characters. Again, as humans, this is part of our like natural neurological programming. Like, we are wired to process information in the format of stories driven by compelling characters. That's what the Bible is. That's what the Bhagavad Gita is. That's what Lord of the Rings and Star Wars are. Like, this is how our brain wants to see things, as like a linear narrative with a cast of compelling characters at the center of it. And we want to share that story with other people, just like back in the caveman days when you're like sitting around the campfire talking about how you killed this big ass woolly mammoth or whatever. And black metal was like the perfect storm of things to take advantage of that part of human psychology, right?
Well, I was involved in a killing.
It was this actually crazy story with super compelling, larger-than-life characters at the center of it that made for like the perfect viral story that took advantage of this sort of inherent pattern of human communication. Dude, did you hear about all those crazy bands in Norway that like burned churches and shit? And just to like really drive that home, compare that with another genre like, say, industrial, that really never captured the public's imagination like that. It's obvious why, right? Like, the story and characters just aren't there the way they are with black metal. So how do you create a story and characters that capture the attention of the people that you want to reach with your marketing? That's the question you need to answer. And third, as my friend Chase Jarvis says, you can't stand out and fit in at the same time. If you want to get the world's attention, you are not going to get it by falling in line and duplicating what other people have already done. Not going to happen. Like, the fact that everything they did was the exact opposite of like what was cool and acceptable in metal at the time, how could you not pay attention to that? And I'm not saying you should be some sort of reactionary and just do everything the opposite of what everyone else is doing just for the sake of being different. That's corny. But what I am saying is, you've got to honestly ask yourself the question of like, what's actually different about what I'm doing, and why would anybody give a shit about it? Ooh, nobody gives a shit. And lastly, there's an audience for everything. It's easy to think that what we're into is so niche and weird that there's nobody else in the world that would ever care about what I'm doing. But look, this stuff is proof that that's not true. It doesn't get much more extreme and challenging and inaccessible than like that early black metal. In fact, it was like expressly designed with the goal of being inaccessible, and yet millions of people all over the world know about it and love it. Again, to draw an analogy to the fine art world, it's kind of like Pollock or Rothko or Duchamp or any of these other people that did this stuff that was like deliberately inaccessible and even like antagonistic to the viewer, and yet that's exactly why it became popular. So don't listen to that voice in the back of your head that tells you that you're never going to be able to get an audience for what you do because it's too weird, it's too niche, it's too out there. If these Norwegian nerds LARPing in the woods can build an audience of millions all over the world, then you can do it too. So there you go. For all the people who ask me to do a black metal video, now you have one. Whether I like this stuff or not, I think it's undeniable that there's a lot that we can learn from it, from like a marketing, consumer psychology, branding kind of perspective. So hopefully this shed a little bit of light on it. So yeah, let me know what you think. Before I let you go, I want to thank everybody who supports me on Patreon at the True Cult level or above. If you're interested in that, there's a link in the description. Patrons get access to a bunch of stuff like an audio-only podcast feed of the videos, a private Discord server. I do a thing where I review your band and social media presence if you want my feedback on that from like a marketing perspective. Bunch of other cool stuff. Check that out at the link if you want. And again, I do have merch for anybody that asked. There's also a link to that in the description. And with that, I'm going to sign off for now, but I will see you next time.